Born in the Gilded Age to the richest family in America, wealth beyond kings, built on steel and steam. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. By 10, she wore steel rods down her spine so she'd stand like a statue. She was trained to smile, to curtsy, to obey, and never speak her mind, because they weren't raising a daughter. They were crafting a duchess, chasing a title. At 17, she broke the rules and fell in love. Her mother collapsed, claimed she was dying. Consuelo was locked away, isolated, forced to give him up. Then she was sold, married off to a British duke in exchange for $10 million and a title. She walked down the aisle in tears. Her veil hid a girl who had never once been asked what she wanted. Her husband called her useful. He cheated. He controlled her. He displayed her like furniture. But this isn't the story of a duchess. It's the story of what happens when a girl raised to be an ornament decides she'll be a weapon instead. Consuelo escaped. She walked out of a palace and into history. Not as a wife, not as a daughter, but as a force. She stood before Parliament, fought for working women, turned her mansion into a hospital, sold her paintings to save lives. She did what other duchesses wouldn't. She acted. And in the end, she found what no crown could give her. Not power, not praise, but peace and love and freedom. When the world tried to define her by gold, she wrote her own ending. From the mansions of Fifth Avenue to the faded palaces of Europe, from debutante balls to war-torn London. This isn't just the story of the wealthiest heiress in the world. It's the story of a woman born a symbol who died free. If you like stories like this, please consider joining the channel. We have over 80 women's biographies on the channel, with more coming every week. And now let's get into the story of the gilded prison of Consuelo Vanderbilt. First thing Consuelo Vanderbilt remembered was the portrait. A little girl in a crimson dress, lace at the throat, fists clenched around bouquets too big for her hands. Painted by the French master Carolus Duran, it showed a child already framed, already formed, for display. Behind her, a heavy curtain. Before her, an audience she could not yet see. The artist had called her a real little devil, but the devil in time would be broken, polished, pressed, perfected. She was born on March 2nd, 1877, into wealth beyond measure. Yet no one wrote it down, not officially, not proudly. Decades later, her aunt would have to recall the house number so Consuelo could reclaim her American citizenship after the war. There was no birth certificate, no keepsake book, no words of joy recorded. She was not a child announced to the world, but a project quietly begun. She was not the heir. She was the offering. The marriage had been the spectacle, the home, the monument. Now Consuelo was the proof. A child born not into love, but into legacy. Her name, even that, was borrowed from her mother's closest friend, Consuelo Yiznaga, a Cuban-American heiress who had just married the future Duke of Manchester. It was a name chosen for its resonance, not its intimacy. A name selected to echo across the salons of Europe. Her mother, Alva Erskine Vanderbilt, was a southern hurricane wrapped in velvet and ambition. Brilliant, unyielding, and precise, she had married into one of the richest families in America. And she would not rest until her daughter crowned that triumph with a title. Alva had battled her way to the summit of society, and she intended to stay there. She would build the world her daughter would live in, and she would design the daughter to fit. Her father, William K. Vanderbilt, was a different force, affable, elegant, and exquisitely detached. Raised in Europe, fluent in French, he became a connoisseur of paintings, horses, and escape. He adored the sea, the stable, and eventually the speed of the motor car. Fatherhood, like marriage, was something he observed from a distance. It was Alva who ruled the house, and what a house it was. At the corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street, she built a limestone palace so grand it made the city's brownstones appear to shrink in embarrassment. Designed in the image of a French chateau, with turrets, gargoyles, flying buttresses, it looked as if the Loire Valley had been uprooted and dropped, stone by stone, into Manhattan. Inside were salons hung with Flemish tapestries, a supper room modeled on the field of the cloth of gold, and a dining hall the size of a ballroom. The grand staircase spiraled upward through clouds of carved cherubs and heraldic grotesques, as if ascending to a coronation. Alva had commissioned it with Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of America's new nobility. Every inch was curated, every detail intentional. For Alva, it was not a home, it was a message, a declaration of power, a statement of permanence. For Consuelo, it became the first stage on which she would perform. Beneath chandeliers and under constant watch, she learned to walk straight, speak softly, and vanish. From her earliest days, she was corrected, shaped, refined. Her nose was too pert, her posture too loose, her voice too curious. When she asked questions, she was silenced. When she hesitated, she was told to try again, gracefully. "I don't ask you to think," her mother once told her. "I do the thinking, you do as you're told." At the age of 10, she was strapped into a steel brace, one rod down her spine, another across her forehead. "Sit up," they said. "Be still. Be elegant." Her legs twitched with pain at night. She would later recall that the servants called it the Vanderbilt fidgets, as if even discomfort was something unseemly. There was a time, she said, when her mother whipped her every single day, a punishment for posture, for defiance, or for nothing at all. She was ridiculed at dinner parties, her nose criticized in front of guests. When she voiced an opinion, she was told she lacked taste, and worse, had no right to one. And yet, Consuelo had a secret world. Books. While her body was being shaped into something ornamental, her mind was moving at speed. In French, German, and English, she devoured history and legend. She memorized La Fontaine, Faust, and wrote essays on the Punic Wars. She dreamed not of gowns or invitations, but of Sparta, of Joan of Arc, of Dickensian heroes who survived on wit and will alone. She admired women who resisted, women who led, women who heard voices no one else believed. And at night, she invented voices of her own, whispered rebellions in the quiet dark. Her younger brother, Willie, just 18 months apart, was her partner in joy. They rowed across the estate's pond, chased frogs, and once upended their governess into the water, laughing until they were caught. At home, they were punished. Willie cried. Consuelo did not. This was her education. Others might have called it cruel. She was told it was excellent. Still, there were rare flashes of warmth. Her nurse, Boya, offered what no one else did, gentleness. It was Boya who brought her to visit the daughter of a groundskeeper, a girl her own age, paralyzed, bedridden, and without even a doll to hold. No pearls, no portraits, just stillness. "How much I owe to Boya," Consuelo would write. "It was from her I learned the happiness helping others brings." Even then, even as a child, she'd begun to question what it meant to be rich and what it meant to be free. At night, she would climb the grand staircase alone to her room. The gas lamps behind her would dim. The walls would creak and sigh. Shadows slipped between the banisters like hands. And in that long, silent ascent, she would whisper the only prayer she knew by heart, courage. Give me courage to reach the top, and one day, perhaps, to escape it. Not the house, not the family, but the fate waiting at the end of the hallway. She was growing. That, at least, was allowed. By 12, Consuelo Vanderbilt was nearly as tall as her mother, though still careful not to rise too fast. Her limbs stretched into elegance, her features lengthened with promise, but her silence remained. She had learned early that to grow was not the same as to become. Growth could be controlled. Becoming was dangerous. And so, under chandeliers and surveillance, she transformed, not into herself, but into the version Alva required. Each morning began with the Rosa classes, an elite enclave of half a dozen girls from the right families, educated in private rooms rather than schools. Latin and literature, mathematics and manners, music and French dictation. They read Milton and Virgil. They wrote essays on empire and duty while carriages passed outside, the rumble of hooves timed like a metronome. Consuelo learned to nod at the right questions and not to ask her own. Her voice, when used, was described as graceful. Her walk was measured in inches and posture. When she sat perfectly upright, whether for a lesson, a luncheon, or the half hour allotted for speaking with her mother. Words were weighed, topics were rehearsed, reactions were managed. The house on Fifth Avenue had become a palace of rehearsal. She was not allowed to visit a friend without permission, not allowed to attend a tea without approval. Not allowed to refuse a dance, a dress, or a chaperone. Her governess kept a diary, submitted weekly. Her reflection was polished. Her thoughts were filed. Her fate was being tailored for export. She was not to fall in love. She was to marry well. Her bedroom overlooked Central Park, though she rarely walked there without escort. She would watch the trees bud in spring, hear the carriages drift past in the summer dusk, and wonder if any of the girls strolling under parasols were free, or merely freer. Her books were her confidants. She read The Mill on the Floss and saw herself in the drowning heroine, trying to float, weighted by duty. She reread Dickens, especially The Orphans. She preferred the poor children to the princesses. The poor were allowed to want. By 15, she was called accomplished. By 16, regal. In Paris, dressmakers measured her waist, 20 inches. American newspapers would later measure her feet, her hands, the arch of her instep. She was becoming not just a woman, but a figure, a shape, a type. She was no longer being raised, she was being positioned. Her mother said it with pride, "She's not just beautiful, she's ready." And in the spring of her 17th year, Consuelo was taken abroad, to Egypt, to Athens, to the temples of India. The yacht Valiant shimmered through foreign harbors, its linen awnings snapping in the wind. At every port, there were dignitaries and receptions, letters of introduction, and lectures on imperial grandeur. Consuelo saw the Nile, the Parthenon, the Ganges. She saw women in saris, in veils, in sun-bleached rags. She saw poverty and ceremony, shrines and deserts, and realized something quietly terrifying. She had seen more of the world than most women ever would, and yet she had touched none of it. Her days were plotted, her company was curated. She saw the Taj Mahal through a veil of protocol. She was not a tourist, she was inventory in motion. But something unexpected happened in the in-between. A man, his name was Winthrop Rutherford, handsome, discreet, American. The sort of gentleman who didn't need to prove anything because he didn't need to take anything. He was no fortune hunter, no title seeker, no European aristocrat in debt to his wallpaper. He was simply kind. He met her without guards, spoke to her without calculation, listened. They first encountered each other during a quiet stretch of her family's tour, perhaps in Paris, perhaps in Cairo. The exact city has blurred. What remained clear always was the warmth of it, the honesty, the lack of strategy. He didn't speak to her governess. He spoke to her. They exchanged books, walked in gardens, spoke in corners. And when he asked, quietly, nervously, sincerely, if she would one day marry him, she said yes. She had chosen something for the first time in her life. It was secret. It was sacred. It was hers. They would announce it soon, she thought, or elope if they had to. He would follow her home. She would face her mother. Perhaps there would be shouting, perhaps worse. But after that, after one long storm, would come peace. It was her one true act of defiance. But Alva already knew. Letters stopped arriving. Friends stopped calling. Doors closed in subtle, synchronized succession. Her governess refused to speak of him. A footman was dismissed. Her social calendar was revised. Her father, distant as ever, said nothing. But her mother had made her position clear. You will not marry that man. Consuelo tried to explain, to plead. She was met with silence, then fury. And then weakness. Alva fainted, claimed to have heart palpitations. A doctor was called. She lay in bed for days, eyes shut, refusing broth, her voice growing thin and tragic. You'll kill me, she whispered. You'll bring shame to this family. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Consuelo, terrified, believed it. Winthrop Rutherford, for all his strength, could not enter her house. His letters were intercepted. His name was blackened in society. She could neither speak to him nor speak of him. And finally, one afternoon when the lamps were being lit and her mother's room reeked of lavender and crisis, Consuelo surrendered. Tell him I can't, she said. She never saw him again. She would marry the Duke of Marlborough. His name was Charles. His nickname was Sunny. He was neither warm nor bright. 6 years older than Consuelo, pale, thin-lipped, with fine hands and a fine opinion of them, the Duke carried with him the bearing of 10 generations of English blood and several centuries of unpaid debt. Blenheim Palace, his ancestral seat, had been a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough, built to glorify war, and now quietly crumbling into its own past. The roof leaked. The staff was unpaid. But the name still glittered in Alva's mind like a crown. What he needed was money. What Alva needed was a title. What Consuelo needed no longer mattered. She agreed. Not from hope, but from exhaustion. Not out of love, but because she had run out of choices. She was 17. Her real engagement had been erased. Her imagined rebellion had nearly killed her mother. What else was there? The announcement was immediate. The press exploded. Her face appeared in papers across 2 continents. Her hair color, her chin shape. She was cataloged and debated. Some reports called her the richest bride in the world. Others mocked her as America's latest export. The dollar princess. She was measured like livestock, but in florals. The New York World reported age, 18 years. Chin pointed, indicating vivacity. Nose slightly retroussé. Waist 20 inches. Marriage settlement $10 million. She was described like a museum piece. Slender of hand, elegant of gait, obedient of bearing. People called it a fairy tale, a triumph. The union of America's wealth with Britain's pedigree. A Vanderbilt duchess. A palace renewed. No one mentioned the man she had loved. No one asked if she was happy. In Paris that spring, she received 10 proposals. Men bowed, flirted, wrote verses, sent roses. But the decision had already been made. She was no longer a girl. She was a headline. The Duke came to visit her. They dined together in stilted formality. He complimented her posture. Her mother beamed. Alva chose the date, the invitations, the embroidery on the veil. Consuelo drifted through the fittings like a paper doll. She received the wedding dress from Paris and her first diamond tiara. She felt nothing. The world called it the match of the century. She called it survival. On the morning of November 6, 1895, New York City bloomed with opera glasses. By 9 a.m., thousands had gathered outside Alva's new mansion on 72nd Street, shoulder to shoulder, necks craned toward the windows. By 10, the police had roped off the block. By 11, Fifth Avenue was a wall of carriages. Inside St. Thomas Church, an orchestra played Wagner. Reporters sharpened metaphors. She was not late. She was hiding. Upstairs, behind a locked door, Consuelo Vanderbilt sat alone in her wedding gown, her face swollen from crying. Her corset dug into her ribs. Her gloves lay in her lap like folded wings. The veil, yards of tulle and embroidery, spilled off her shoulders like fog. She had tried not to cry, but the tears came anyway. 20 minutes passed. Below, the Duke shifted on the altar. Guests murmured. Ushers panicked. The orchestra kept playing. She had considered running. That morning, before the maids arrived with breakfast, she had stared at the street and wondered what would happen if she simply disappeared into the crowd. Walked into the park, caught a train, escaped. But where would she go? Winthrop was gone. Her father was silent. Her mother had recovered. And the world, this great echoing world, was watching. Years later, Alva would become a crusader for women's suffrage. She would stand on podiums and speak of liberty. But the first vote her daughter ever cast was this: to betray her own heart. So she stood. A footman opened the door. Another fixed her train. The veil was lowered over her face, the tears tucked beneath it. The bells rang. Outside, the crowd surged. Inside, the floral arches dripped with roses and chrysanthemums, lilies and ivy sweeping from gallery to nave. Palm leaves trembled in the heat of the gaslight. The doors opened, and Consuelo walked forward. No one could see her face. No one could hear her breathing. But she could hear everything. Every shoe scuff, every cough, every whisper. She had no bouquet. It had not arrived. Her father walked beside her, dutiful, distant. The church was a dreamscape of wealth and spectacle. 1,400 guests, 60 musicians, 50 choristers, 2 bishops, and not a single escape route. She had not run. That was all the world needed to know. She reached the altar, said the vows, heard her name changed. And somewhere in the applause that followed, the girl who had once whispered courage with each step on the staircase was replaced by someone else. The Duchess of Marlborough had arrived. She had not married a man. She had married a dynasty. There was no honeymoon, not in the romantic sense. No seclusion, no sunlit journey into shared intimacy. What followed was a week at Idle Hour, the Vanderbilt estate on Long Island, familiar, stately, but drained of warmth. They were 2 near strangers inhabiting a single tableau. She wore the title. He wore indifference. They dined in silence. They took tea and practiced civility. At night, she retired alone. Like a deserted child, I longed for my family, she would later write. I faced life beside a stranger, within a world I could not reach. Then came the voyage. There were few ocean liners to Italy in those days, only cargo ships. They boarded a vessel suited for freight and brine, not for brides. Her husband was ill during the crossing, physically sick and emotionally absent. She nursed him quietly, without complaint. The captain offered no courtesies. There was no doctor aboard. The sea was rough. The journey, she would later recall, felt longer than the Atlantic deserved. They arrived in Spain in the dead of winter. Madrid greeted them with icy winds and colorless skies. Seville was somber. Granada, though rich with history, seemed to her a city not of passion, but of ghosts. They visited cathedrals where Madonnas wore ermine capes and golden crowns, their eyes staring out beneath jeweled lashes. She was unsettled by the spectacle of grief, religion draped in velvet and pain, but dared not speak it aloud. Then came Rome. It was there, among the ruins and Renaissance facades, that her body failed her. She fell ill, exhausted, pale, and weak. A Roman doctor, summoned in haste, offered a diagnosis with the unflinching calm of a priest delivering last rites. 6 months, he told her, perhaps a year. She was 18, and now, perhaps, dying. It was not the death that terrified her. It was the idea that her life had not yet begun. At 18, she wrote, I was beginning to chafe at the impersonal role I had so far played in my own life. In truth, the illness passed. The diagnosis was wrong. A second physician corrected it. But the emotional reality remained. She had lived so long in silence that even death seemed impersonal. They continued to Paris. There, in the salons of Worth and Doucet, her trousseau was completed, under her husband's supervision. He insisted on grandeur, not grace. Pink velvet gowns trimmed in sable, blue satin with ostrich feathers. Jewels were selected, gloves matched to gowns. A diamond dog collar so tight it chafed her throat. A tiara so heavy it gave her migraines. She did not choose. She complied. She had been told not to draw attention to herself, but now she was being shaped into a creature meant to be looked at. Then, England. The arrival in London was as ceremonial as a state function, and just as impersonal. Carriages, a receiving line, stiff introductions. She met her husband's relatives, who were also her new judges. The Churchill-Hamilton clan, as she would come to call them. There was Lady Sarah Wilson, all hard angles and louder opinions. There was Winston, just beginning his political rise. Lady Randolph Churchill, Jenny Jerome, another American who had once struggled under the weight of English titles. For more on Jenny, her marriage to Randolph, and her relationship with her son Winston, please see our video on the channel. For a time, Jenny would prove to be a confidant. The rest smiled politely. No one asked if she was well. They simply observed her, assessed her. They saw not a girl, but a duchess. They did not like Americans. They had never liked Jenny, but they liked American money. She said nothing, smiled gracefully, learned how to vanish inside a room. Then came Blenheim. They entered the gates beneath a stone arch. A porter in powdered livery greeted them with a silver-topped wand. Her new home emerged from the mist like a Roman ruin born in the Age of Kings. The palace rose from the Oxfordshire woods like a fortress carved from golden stone. Its windows, hundreds of them, watched her without blinking. Blenheim always impressed one by its immense size and beauty, she later wrote, but at the cost of intimacy. It had been built by decree of Queen Anne, a palace not of love but of victory, a reward for war. The rooms were vast, the staircases long. Portraits of dead dukes lined the halls like reminders of duty. There were salons meant for hundreds, fireplaces that roared into silence, a long gallery of books that no one read. She was shown to her chambers by servants who did not meet her gaze. Her trunks were unpacked, her bed turned down. The house was ready. She was not. Her husband kept to himself. He was polite, measured, reserved. He complimented her posture once at breakfast. He mentioned the weather. He praised the staff. He had been raised not to love but to preserve. He never touched her, not in affection, not in intimacy. They shared dinners, appearances, obligations, not life. There were no shared stories, no private jokes, no warmth. She had exchanged one form of silence for another. She learned her duties quickly. She curtsied, She received guests, she dined with duchesses and lords and ambassadors. She was presented at court. Her dresses were perfect, her English refined, her posture impeccable. She had become what was required. I became, she would write, the ornament to a house built for someone else's triumph. She became admired in public and unacknowledged in private. There was no rebellion, there was only routine. She was praised for her grace, she was admired for her modesty, and no one noticed she was disappearing. Outdoors, the landscape offered a different kind of silence. The villagers, though deferential, were human. The children did not know how to bow properly. The old women curtsied with shaky knees. The men removed their caps but smiled with their eyes. She began to visit the schools, the hospitals, the poorhouses. There she asked questions, and for the first time in years, someone answered honestly. They did not care what her waist measured. They did not care what her title was. They cared that she came, that she listened, that she remembered their names. Back at Blenheim, nothing changed. She was still expected at breakfast, still expected to smile at diplomats, host garden parties, hold her husband's arm at public events. The staff still averted their eyes. Her husband still slept in another room. Her mother, from across the sea, still sent instructions written in the language of success. She obeyed. She performed. But something had begun to stir, not loudly, not visibly, but quiet, certain, alive. I had made a brilliant marriage, she wrote. I had done my duty, and I was alone. Then came her first child. The labor was long, difficult, and largely private. She was attended by midwives and doctors, but her husband remained elsewhere. The palace was hushed, watchful, expectant, not for her safety, but for the lineage she carried. And when the child finally came, a boy, whole and wailing, the house erupted in celebration, not for the mother, but for the future Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo lay in a darkened room while bells were rung in the surrounding villages. Telegrams flew to London. The staff drank champagne. The Duke allowed himself a rare smile. The Spencer-Churchill dynasty had its heir. The line was secured. Her body, still aching, was acknowledged briefly. I had fulfilled my purpose, she would later write. I had given them what they wanted. She named him John. He had her mouth, the Duke's eyes, and a crown waiting for him. She loved him with a quiet intensity that surprised her. In that vast and echoing house where every glance was managed and every word measured, he became her secret, a source of warmth in a palace of marble. Around her, Blenheim bloomed into motion. Bells rang in the village. Toasts were raised in town. The servants stepped lightly, as if royalty had arrived. But upstairs, behind drawn curtains, the woman who had delivered him sat in silence, too sore to stand, too dazed to speak. But she was not allowed to hold him as she wished. A nanny was installed immediately. Traditions were cited. A mother, she was told, must not spoil an heir with too much affection. He was to be seen at intervals, cared for by professionals, raised with dignity. Her love was permitted, but not her presence. I had longed to give him the freedom I had once dreamed of for myself, but the rules were older than either of us. She watched him grow through doorways and formal photographs. She was told when he was teething, when he slept, when he needed a new tutor. She received updates like a guest of honor, not a mother. She complied. She smiled at parties, posed beside his cradle for portraits, and appeared on cue when the Duke summoned her. But behind the grace was something newer, a kind of pain that sharpened rather than dulled. This was no longer the pain of obedience. This was the pain of knowing what she could not give. A second son followed, Ivor. There was no pageantry this time, no bells, no telegrams, no champagne. The dynasty already had its heir. This child was reassurance, a spare, in the language of aristocracy. But to Consuelo, he was not a spare. He was hers. She loved him as fiercely as she loved John, though the world required less of him, and therefore allowed her slightly more. She held him longer, sat beside his cradle at night, spoke to him when no one watched. He gurgled and smiled and curled his hand around her finger, not because of a title or a future, but because she was warm and near. And for the first time, she felt necessary. Not to England, not to Blenheim, but to someone who had never seen a crest or a crown. With Ivor, I was allowed something closer to motherhood. But even then, the rules circled back. Nannies arrived, schedules resumed, the walls between mother and child reformed like frost across glass. And so she adapted again. She gave to others what she could not always give to her sons. A shelter for orphaned children tucked behind a chapel where thin girls in threadbare pinafores greeted her with wide, unpracticed curtsies. She went back the next week. Then the week after that. She learned names, asked questions, remembered details. She did not arrive in pearls and gowns. She arrived early, often, without ceremony. And they began to greet her not as a duchess, but as someone who came back. There was no transformation overnight, no triumphant declaration, no rebellion, just the slow, growing certainty that this was real. Not the gowns, not the dinners, not the practiced smile on a ballroom staircase, but this, a hand on a child's forehead, a name remembered, a window without a curtain. She dreamed once that she was walking through town without gloves. Her hair was loose, her arms were bare, and no one stopped her. For the first time, she would write, "I was not acting, I was present." Her husband did not notice. When the Duke began to spend more and more time in London, ostensibly for Parliament, she made no inquiry. When he returned less frequently, she made no protest. His absences, like his presence, were conducted in the language of silence. There were whispers of his affairs, of course. Society always whispered. But the whispers were not about her heartbreak. They were about her composure. She did not confront him. She knew her place. In public, her beauty became her reputation. She was praised in newspapers as the most elegant of hostesses, an ornament to the Marlborough name, a model of restraint. But by now, as so much in Consuelo's life, the marriage had become a performance perfected. She once passed him in the corridor, he coming from one end, she from another. A footman paused and bowed to both. They nodded to one another with the grace of acquaintances at a public event. She did not remember what they said, only that they moved past each other like ghosts in daylight, acknowledged present, but already fading behind them. They appeared together at court, at garden parties, at the opera. They posed side by side for portraits and waved from carriages. They spoke in clipped, cordial tones. At public dinners, he complimented her taste in flowers. She complimented his speeches. They were admired as a pair, elegant, polished, enviable. "My husband was invariably courteous," she wrote, "but there was no companionship. But at night, in her room, when the candles were low and the fire had gone to embers, she would sit by the window with a book unopened in her lap, listening not for footsteps down the hall, but for her own breath. The silence no longer frightened her. It no longer meant emptiness. It meant space. And within that space she began, slowly, quietly, finally, to think. It was in those years," she wrote later, "that I began to understand that obedience is not always virtue, and silence is not always peace." She had once been made into a portrait. Now she was beginning to sketch herself. The century turned with ceremony, not revolution. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and with her, an age ended, not in flames, but in velvet. The mourning veils came down. The empire held its breath. And in that hush, a new kind of spectacle began. On the morning of Edward VII's coronation, Consuelo stood beneath the ducal canopy, cloth of gold suspended above her head like a crown she did not wear. Her train shimmered behind her. Her jewels caught the torchlight. From the choir loft, trumpets sounded, and the floor seemed to rise with sound. But she stood motionless, decorous, remote, alone. The other duchesses whispered. One glanced sideways, another adjusted her gloves without looking up. They were queens of lineage, of diamonds, of households older than history, and Consuelo stood among them as the American. She held her posture. She knew the choreography. She bowed at the proper time and retreated in step, and when the king and queen passed by, she lowered her eyes. Around her neck, a collar of diamonds sat like armor, gleaming, suffocating, exquisitely heavy, a gift, a symbol, a leash. "I stood beneath cloth of gold," she later wrote, "and no one noticed I had disappeared." That evening, they dined at the palace. The room was candlelit and immense. Goblets gleamed, silver clinked. The king complimented the duchess's composure. She bowed her head. No one asked what she had seen. No one asked how it had felt. They asked only if the veil had caught the light. That winter, the Marlboroughs journeyed to Russia, drawn by the grandeur of a court that glittered like legend and trembled like warning. St. Petersburg shimmered with snow and suspicion. The European hotel, for all its gilded decor, felt stale and airless. The streets were wide but windswept, the palaces imposing but hollow. At first glance, it was splendor. At second, strain. At the Winter Palace, Consuelo wore white satin. Her tiara flashed beneath chandeliers. Scarlet footmen stood sentinel. Mazurkas began. Grand Duke Michael took her hand and laughed when she stumbled. "Never mind," he said. "I'll do the steps." He would be executed 16 years later. At another supper, her seat was left empty. When the Tsar arrived, he filled it. "Russia is not ready for democracy," he told her softly. "We are 200 years behind Europe." He feared his ministers, feared the people, feared giving power long enough for anyone to become dangerous. Then he smiled gently at her with a wink. "I know everything you've done in Russia. The secret police send me reports." Behind the charm, the system watched. The Tsarina refused to receive her, but Grand Duchess Vladimir did, displaying her legendary jewels like a general flaunting weapons. She would one day smuggle them out and survive on their sale. At the Hermitage, supper was served among Van Dyck's and saints under flickering candlelight. A familiar tune played, Malbrook s'en va en guerre. The Tsar smiled. She smiled back, but unease stirred. Versailles again, she thought. Everything glittered, Consuelo wrote. Nothing breathed. Then in 1903 they were invited to India. Lord Curzon staged the Delhi Durbar like an imperial opera. Gun salutes, gilded elephants, guards in golden sashes. A palace of tents shimmered in the dust. Each one had its own salon, its own bath. But privacy was fiction. At the great ball, Lady Curzon wore a gown embroidered with peacock feathers. They whispered it was bad luck. She died not long after. Consuelo waved to cheering crowds. She smiled in unbearable heat. She dined in splendor while famine-starved children watched from behind palace walls. She had been taught that empire was stability, but now she saw only shadows in the sun. Even the crowns, she wrote, were copies of something lost. At the Purdah party, she met Indian princesses behind embroidered screens, luminous, poised, painted like miniatures. But to Consuelo, they felt like butterflies, beautiful, still, unable to fly. One morning, she joined a falcon hunt at dawn. The sun rose over the plains. The birds soared, unhooded, circling. It could dive at 150 miles per hour. One had flown from Fontainebleau to Malta in a single day. But what she remembered most was this. From a minaret, she looked down into darkness. A single firework burst, and beneath it, a sea of upturned faces. Turbans of every shade, eyes gleaming. Not joy. It was rapture. Then on to Vienna. The city still glittered with operettas and empire. Introduced by Count Mensdorff, Consuelo entered easily. She met Emperor Franz Joseph, small, grave, heavy with grief. On Maundy Thursday, she watched him wash the feet of 12 poor men. The archdukes laid out food. It was whisked away. The gesture remained. The soul was gone. She visited the Spanish riding school, watched a groom catch a horse's waist midair so it wouldn't touch the floor. The Viennese laughed. She did too. But she could no longer hear the music. Her hearing had begun to vanish, not all at once, but like a ballroom filling with fog. The world had not gone silent. It had simply stopped including her. Vienna, she thought, was a stage. The rituals survived, but the meaning had drained away. When John Singer Sargent arrived at Blenheim to paint her, he was brisk, fidgeting, always smoking. He refused to let her wear pearls, called her neck a tree trunk. Her dress was ivory satin, her posture impeccable. The boys stood beside her. The Duke wore his garter robes. Sargent worked quickly. He didn't need revision. "He captured me beautifully," she said, "but he did not find me." When the portrait was hung in the Great Hall, she looked at it the same way others did, from the outside. She returned to England with letters to answer and public events to attend. She did so perfectly. There were no scandals, no refusals. The Duchess was always present, always framed just right. But her voice had softened, her step had slowed. She was no longer performing for love or even approval, only for the preservation of the story being told around her. "I was still called the Duchess," she would write, "but I had already become someone else." Consuelo and Sonny had been married 11 years. Time hadn't softened their differences, it had sharpened them. The quiet war between two mismatched souls bound by rank and ritual had run its course. Divorce was almost unthinkable in Edwardian England. A man needed only proof of adultery. A woman required abandonment, violence, or disgrace. And yet in 1906, they separated. There was no quarrel, no final scene. Just a letter left on her writing desk at Sunderland House. I believe it is time we consider a formal arrangement. There was no cruelty in it, no insult. Just the familiar hand of the Duke, measured, precise, and impersonal. The formal end to a marriage that had long since dissolved. Consuelo did not weep. She did not pace the room. She stood at the window, overlooking Grosvenor Square, and watched the light fall across the pavement as a nursemaid walked two children toward the park. There was no rupture, she would write later. Only a removal. As if a painting had been taken down from a wall, leaving the outline faintly visible behind it. Her fingers curled around the curtain. The fire had not been lit. Her breakfast tray did not come. She had sent the staff away for the morning. For the first time in years, she chose the quiet. She did not cry. She simply took down the small wedding portrait on her mantel, framed in tortoise shell, posed to perfection, and placed it in a drawer face down. This was not the end of her life. It was merely the beginning. In London, her Fridays began to gather those who needed no invitation and bowed to no titles. George Bernard Shaw brought wine. Galsworthy brought opinions. The Webbs came with pamphlets, Yeats with questions, Nancy Astor with an eyebrow raised, Lady Cunard with a laugh too loud for her pearls. There were no place cards, no orchestra, no agenda but conversation. They argued about suffrage and socialism, Irish verse and industrial reform. No one asked about the Duke. No one mentioned Blenheim. They addressed her as Consuelo, not your grace, not madam, just her name. Once, after midnight, as the last guest slipped into the fog, she stood by the empty decanter and the low fire and thought, this is what society should feel like. Not ceremony, but belonging. Though the court refused to receive separated women, London society came. It was not rebellion, but grace under pressure. But as the music faded and the last applause died, the halls grew quiet again. The children were sent to school. The letters slowed. The echo of the evening lingered, but it was not enough. Not anymore. She had stood on the staircase. Now she needed to climb higher, into work that mattered. She found it in Ensley Street. The house smelled of coal, starch, and damp wood. It was a home for the wives of first offenders, women whose husbands had been sent to prison, leaving them behind with children and shame. The church army called it a refuge. Most simply called it temporary. She had come expecting to observe. Instead, a baby was placed in her arms. He hasn't cried since last week, said one of the matrons. But he won't sleep either. The child's skin was warm and dry, his limbs stiff. He blinked but did not fuss. She rocked him carefully, awkwardly conscious of her gloves. Consuelo visited the next week. Then the week after that. She leased 2 houses. She turned them into laundries, sewing rooms, nurseries. The women worked. Their children were cared for. At night, she read them prayers. We like the Duchess to read to us, one said. But she always makes us cry. Some clergy approved. Others whispered that she had gone too far, stepping beyond the ornamental bounds of charity into something unsettlingly real. She ignored them. From charity, she turned to policy. She joined the National Commission on the Declining Birth Rate, the only laywoman among doctors, priests, economists, and eugenicists. Consuelo did not flinch. Beside her sat Dr. Marie Stopes, scandalous, brilliant, unafraid. Her books silenced pulpits. Consuelo sat at the end of the table, perfectly upright, gloved hands folded in her lap. When called upon, she spoke quietly but without hesitation. She described overcrowded tenements, malnourished infants, mothers with no access to medical care. She quoted midwives, school inspectors, and women she had met in the homes. One of the men scoffed. Another, a clergyman known as the Gloomy Dean, frowned. But then Marie Stopes stood. I believe, she said, that the Duchess of Marlborough is the only person here speaking from lived truth rather than abstract morality. There was no applause, only silence. Later, in her diary, Consuelo wrote, I had never expected to be heard, only to be counted. That day, I was both. By 1907, the press had given her a name, the Working Duchess. At first, it felt pointed, almost mocking. But over time, it became accurate. If not warm, then at least true. Across the Atlantic, her mother began to write again, Not commands, not corrections, but reflections. "You are becoming what I could not," Alva wrote. "I admire you for it." There was no apology, but something in the spacing of the words felt like release to Consuelo. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer where she had once kept a silver rattle, an ivory fan, and a letter that had set her free. They exchanged news of suffrage speeches and playground campaigns, of prison mothers and Westminster bills. Alva described women chained to iron railings in front of the Capitol. Consuelo wrote of women sewing in silence behind Ensley doors. They were not close, but now they were aligned. In 1908, Consuelo returned to America at the Waldorf Astoria to give her first public speech for children's needs. 700 guests filled the ballroom. Colonel George Harvey urged her forward. She had dreaded it, but duty outweighed fear. She had been announced as a duchess. The crowd expected aristocratic pleasantries. Instead, she spoke of Ensley Street, of cracked teacups, overcrowded lodgings, and mothers who fed their children tea to quiet their hunger. She spoke slowly, her voice low at first, then steadier, firmer. Dignity is not conferred by title, it is sustained by recognition. There was a moment's hush at the end, then applause, scattered, then rising, until the room was full of hands and sound. Her marriage had ended, but the silence she'd endured had taught her how to listen. And now she used it to make others heard. She had once been part of a story. Now she was beginning to write one. In November 1913, Sunderland House opened its doors to a carefully selected guest list. Bishops in stiff collars, politicians with polished shoes, society women balancing lorgnettes and expectations. They arrived expecting tea and conversation, a graceful morning's nod to charity. What they encountered was something else entirely. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, had summoned them not to flatter, but to confront. With Margaret Lawrence and Gertrude Tuckwell beside her, she presided over a conference designed not to comfort, but to expose. One by one, 12 working women took the stage. A shirtmaker held up a blouse, her fingers tight around the cloth. "A dozen shirts earns 9 pence, she said. Another voice, clear and unflinching, 8 shillings a week. I've never eaten a dinner that cost more than a penny." No one spoke, no one smiled, and no one, not even the industrialists in the back row, could look away. By the end of the week, 8 additional trades had received legal protection. It was not a riot, it was not a headline. It was something quieter and more subversive. The truth, spoken in the language of suffering, echoing through rooms of carved marble. For Consuelo, it was a moment of clarity and collapse. After a speech in Liverpool, she rode the train home in silence. Her limbs ached, her breath came shallow. A hot water bottle warmed her feet, but still she shook. And as the countryside slipped past in dusk and fog, her thoughts turned, inevitably, to her mother. Alva Vanderbilt, once her tormentor, had changed. Widowhood had not softened her, but redirected her. Alva had hurled herself into the suffrage movement with the same force she had once used to mold a debutante's spine. But this time, the ambition was not personal, it was political. She marched, she funded, she organized, and remarkably, she invited Consuelo not as pupil, but partner. Through her, Consuelo met the women who led the charge. Emmeline Pankhurst, fierce beneath lace and bone, Christabel, fire-tongued and defiant, Dr. Anna Shaw, who had once delivered babies and sermons with equal authority. These women had suffered. Some had starved, some had bled, and none begged permission. One letter from Alva stayed with her. In response to a New York committee debating how best to rehabilitate courtesans, Alva wrote, "To ask what to do with the young courtesan is to begin in the wrong place. Arrest the men who create the need. Let their guilt fund the women they destroy." It wasn't maternal warmth. It was something fiercer, unvarnished justice. A woman once consumed by status now advocating for the invisible and discarded. In 1913, Consuelo stood beside her at the International Woman Suffrage Alliance in Budapest, listening to Anna Shaw preach beneath vaulted ceilings. For the first time, their work felt shared. Not staged, not rehearsed, real. Then came war. She had booked passage on the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, set to sail on August 3, 1914. On August 2nd, the voyage was canceled. Warnings rippled through the shipping lines. Routes changed. Neutral flags were hoisted higher. Submarines prowled familiar waters. 3 days later, she boarded a brightly lit American steamer. Other ships passed in darkness, their hulls scrubbed of identity. Her sons were still at Eton. Blanford, barely 17, had already been measured for war. The American Women's War Relief Fund asked her to serve. She said yes. Within months, she led the opening of hospitals in Devon and London. She organized committees, raised funds, and trained women to take up roles left vacant by enlisted men. When proposals arose, Mrs. Whitelaw Reid simply asked, "How much do you need?" and pledged it. By 1915, Sunderland House had become a meeting ground for the war's invisible architects. Her home for prisoners' wives became a maternity annex. 18 beds for unwed mothers, girls carrying more than shame. One of them wept beside her newborn. Her husband, a Black American, had left for the front. The baby's pale skin terrified her. A nurse tried to reassure her. Newborns often look pale at birth. His color will come. But the fear of judgment, abandonment, disbelief remained. In 1916, Consuelo gave the priestly lecture on infant mortality. She did not speak in abstractions. She began with a stark truth. 1 in every 8 children born in Britain dies before their first birthday. In London's poorest boroughs, the toll was worse. Disease ran rampant. Babies were wrapped in newspaper for warmth. Clinics turned away the unmarried, and Consuelo named what others would not: venereal disease, malnutrition, shame. Some in the audience stood and left. The Times called her brave. She launched the Jewel Fund. Give a jewel to save a baby's life. Cartier opened its vaults. Tiaras, tin lockets, wedding bands. Lloyd George's scarf pin sold, twice. £50,000 poured in. But money, she learned, was never enough. For every maternity bed she opened, 10 more were needed. For every child she saved, another slipped through the cracks. Charity could soothe, but not cure. And the disease was structural. Policies that punished, laws that excluded, lives made invisible. If she wanted to change the rules, she'd need to sit in the room where the rules were written. Politics came next. The major parties offered women no real seat, so she helped found the Women's Municipal Party. No whip, no machine, just women, widowed, titled, determined, tired of waiting for someone else's permission. Alva urged her forward. Not as ornament, she said, but as instrument. In 1917, Consuelo ran for London County Council in North Southwark. They deliberated, then chose her. She won. Again in 1919. Children sang in the streets, "Vote, vote, vote for Mrs. Marlborough." Inside the council, she worked on housing, heat, education. She walked the slums and invited the Prince of Wales to join her. He did. "I wish my mother wore hats like yours," he said. But he listened. A disgruntled driver, dismissed for poor performance, began spreading rumors that she owned slum tenements. It was a lie, but damaging. She answered it quietly. No denials, no scandal, just a tram ride to her next public meeting, refusing to stand above those she served. One night, she noticed a man trailing her down a darkened street. Her heart pounded, her pace quickened. So did his. But at her next gathering, when she rose to speak, he stood at the back and applauded. A supporter, it turned out. He had only wanted to ensure she got home safe. Even courage, it seemed, could be mistaken for risk. Sunderland House had grown cold. No heat, no privacy. 10 housemaids quit. One muttered on her way out, "I thought this was a house. It's a town hall." In 1918, she handed it over. The Inter-Allied Council took possession. Arthur Balfour sent thanks. Paul Cravath took her rooms. Her sons were scattered across the front. Blanford rode with the cavalry in France. Ivor, barred from combat, served in logistics. Her brothers crossed the Atlantic in navy blue. She wrote them all, daily, faithfully, never knowing which letter might be the last. Crowhurst took in wounded officers. Its halls echoed with crutches, coughs, and quiet grief. Her parlor became a ward. Her garden, a vegetable patch. On November 11, 1918, the sirens sounded across London, not in warning, but in wonder. Peace. She stood on the balcony of the county council building and looked out on a city that had bled for 4 years. Crowds surged, flags unfurled. The air trembled with hymns, with joy, with release. Then the French marched past, shrunken in number, solemn in step. She did not cheer. She wept. for Paris, for Verdun, for the boys who did not return, and for the world they left behind. Peace brought no rest. The headlines shifted. The sirens fell silent, but the broken world remained. Slums still festered. Mothers still begged for blankets. Laws still lagged behind the lives they governed. Exhausted in body and spirit, Consuelo withdrew to Alva's villa among citrus groves and Mediterranean light. Alva was older now, slower, but no less certain. They sat in the garden, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing letters and wounds. Years of distance and dominance softened into something like tenderness. And in that quiet reconciliation, Consuelo allowed herself, finally, to rest. In 1920, Blandford married Lady Mary Cadogan, daughter of the 5th Earl Cadogan. The wedding took place at St. Margaret's, Westminster, beneath a pale winter sun. The pews were filled with titled names, with the shattered remnants of a generation. Consuelo watched her son, the future Duke, stand at the altar, polished, poised, and heartbreakingly young. She blessed the match, but as Mary took her son's arm, a shadow passed, faint, familiar. A girl in white, a door quietly closing. Then came the letter. It arrived in 1921, brief, elegant, predictable. Sonny wanted a divorce. Gladys would not be a mistress. She would be a duchess. There was no courtroom scene, no scandal in the papers. The divorce was quietly obtained in Paris. Mutual consent, no accusations, no counterclaims. The headlines were courteous. Duke and Duchess part amicably. She moved to a smaller house with ivy on the walls and sunlight in the kitchen. No staff waited in doorways. No footmen flanked the stairs. She learned to make her own tea. She sat by the fire in her slippers, and one morning she realized she had not heard her name announced in weeks, and no one had bowed. No one had asked her to smile. No one had called her the Duchess of Marlborough. They had called her Consuelo. Sonny married Gladys Deacon that summer. There was no church wedding, no photographs, just a line in the Times. She read it once, then went for a walk. The sun was warm. The air carried the smell of wet grass and stone, and for the first time in decades, she walked with no destination, no duty, no script. She had been traded for a title. Now she had given it back, and she did not miss it. The year 1920 was shadowed by sorrow. Her father, gravely ill, died with quiet dignity. Consuelo was with him to the end. He bore his suffering without complaint, and when the Duc de Gramont sent condolences on behalf of the French Jockey Club, his words were simple. His death will be a great loss to the French racing world. Letters arrived from every corner. Aristocrats, jockeys, stable hands, surgeons. The Paris clinic he had funded mourned deeply. Consuelo had often helped there alongside her stepmother. Now she helped plan the burial. He was laid to rest in the family vault on Staten Island. In the house where once children had peered down on balls from the upstairs gallery, hymns now echoed through closed doors. She spent long, still weeks in her mother's medieval-style home on Long Island. Alva had helped win the vote. She had become president of the National Woman's Party. But she was alone. Consuelo prepared to begin again. She sold Sunderland House, gave Portman Square to her son, released Crowhurst. Each home carried its own memory, each farewell its own grief. But she knew it was time. Her sons were grown, Blandford happily married, Ivor studying at Oxford. She had given them stability. Now she needed freedom. She moved into the Paris house her father had given her, but his death had ended the companionship she had hoped for. Alva joined her there, and with her Aunt Jenny, they built something soft and quiet. Waiting for the final steps of divorce, Consuelo leased a villa near Eze-sur-Mer. She traveled often to England, but she did not expect to fall in love. On July 4, 1921, she married Jacques Balsan in the Chapel Royal of the Savoy at 9 a.m. to avoid reporters. This was quieter, warmer. They followed with a civil ceremony. Colonel George Harvey, American ambassador, and General Cornelius Vanderbilt stood as witnesses. There was no coronet, no throne, but there was peace. Jacques was beloved everywhere, kind, clever, brave. Children loved him. So did generals, gardeners, and grand dames. He was, she realized, not a man who needed to impress, but one who knew how to care. Jacques was a pilot, but before planes, he flew balloons. In 1899, he floated from France to Russia, crashing in Prussia and landing at the estate of Baron von Bandemer. He was greeted politely, shown a monument to the French defeat at Sedan, and sent on his way. He bought his first airplane in 1909 and earned pilot license number 18. In Morocco, he flew reconnaissance against the Moors, risking capture and torture. In 1913, he received the Legion of Honor. In World War I, he scouted during the First Battle of the Marne. Later, with Consuelo's father and Dr. Gross, he helped establish the Lafayette Escadrille, precursor to the American Air Force. They had met years before, when she was still a newlywed and he a dashing guest at Blenheim. During the war, he had once sent her a postcard before a bombing run. "I did not expect to return." Now he had. Their marriage was not recognized by the Catholic Church. In France, where Catholicism ruled society, divorce was rare, and remarriage without annulment forbidden. His family, devout and bound to tradition, could not receive her. She asked him not to break with them. She would wait. When, in 1926, Marlborough sought his own annulment, the moment came. With the help of her mother, an old governess, she petitioned Rome. Her lawyer, Sir Charles Russell, warned only proof of coercion would suffice. Alva consented, as a way to apologize for that action so long ago. She admitted she had forced her daughter unwillingly to marry. The Vatican ruled in her favor. No bribes had passed, only courage and peace. Now married in the church, Consuelo was welcomed into the Balsan family. At the chateau in Châteauroux, once established by the Prince de Condé, she met them all. Madame Charles Balsan, Jacques' great-aunt, presided in lace and black. She offered Consuelo a golden heirloom box. "We loved him too," she seemed to say, "and now we love you." Later, Consuelo wrote her a letter of thanks. The matriarch read it aloud to the family. It was, she recalled, a moment of true reconciliation. In Paris, she and Jacques made their home near the green lawns of the Champs de Mars. From her window, she watched cavalry officers trot by at dawn. Children played. Readers claimed benches. The Seine shimmered. The Eiffel Tower blinked its message to the sky. Their house, designed in 18th century style, was filled with antiques and discoveries from long walks along the quays. Renoir's La Baigneuse hung in their salon until they sold it in 1946 to aid French children. Paris life was elegance, but not idleness. Consuelo hosted modest luncheons with literary guests. Edith Wharton visited frequently. She chaired charity events. The British Embassy, once owned by Pauline Borghese, held glittering dinners under Napoleon's gold service. Here, old castes mingled: Bourbon, Bonaparte, Republican. She watched it all with grace and growing understanding. In 1926, she was asked to help build a hospital for the middle class, those too proud for charity, too poor for private care. The hilltop site near Vincennes had once belonged to Jean Worth. With Dr. Dubouchet and Bernard Flersheim, she led the campaign. 360 rooms and a nursing school. Fundraising became fete. Grand Prix dinners, peacock balls, raffles with Fabergé clocks. Musicians clamored to perform. She loved Paris most in the spring. Acacia blossoms opened toward the light. The Seine shimmered. Old men fished without expectation. The world for a time appeared content. But outside the salons and sun-drenched afternoons, shadows were lengthening. France was restless. The strikes grew louder, the workers more defiant. And though she did not fear them, she could feel something shifting, something solemn gathering on the horizon. The 1930s unfolded like a long, low exhale. It was a quiet death. Alva Belmont, once a hurricane wrapped in velvet and resolve, had grown still. Her eyesight had faded. Her voice, once so sharp it could slice ambition from air, now came only in murmurs. At the villa in Neuilly, the world dimmed around her. Consuelo came as often as she could. There were no arguments anymore, no instructions, no blame. They spoke softly or not at all. Sometimes they simply sat, two women who had once shared a war, now sharing silence. On January 26, 1933, her mother died in her sleep. There were no trumpets, no suffrage banners, just a short notice, a modest funeral at the American Cathedral in Paris. Maggie Stevenson arranged it with tact and devotion. Consuelo wore black. She did not cry. She did not need to. The grief had come years earlier in the partings that had hurt more than any passing. She sat near the front. The lilies on the casket were pale and unscented. The marble beneath her shoes colder than it should have been. No one called Alva a villain that day, nor a heroine, only a name, a date, a pause. But Consuelo felt it, not just the loss of a mother, but the end of the scaffolding on which her life had once been built. The last great tower of her childhood had fallen, and she was still standing. She taught me strength, she would later write, but it was forgiveness that let me carry it. The war came again, not with fanfare, but with a whisper. She and Jacques fled Paris as the Germans advanced, their car heavy with essentials, their spirits lightened only by one another. The roads were choked with others fleeing, nurses, priests, mothers with wide-eyed children. At a friend's chateau in the Loire, they paused. The air was thick with silence. For a moment, the war stood still. Then they crossed to America. She returned not to the marble mansions of her youth, but to her brother's quiet house in the countryside. The grandeur of her girlhood was gone, swept away by history, softened by memory. America had changed, so had she. She resumed her work quietly. No fanfare, no feathers. Just relief work, letters, parcels for French families, and funds raised for the wounded. In New York drawing rooms, she spoke without pretense. "What I do is small," she said once, "but so is bread, and it still feeds the hungry." When the war ended, she returned to France. Paris was still there, though thinner around the edges. The lawns of the Champs de Mars had grown wild. The house was dusted but undisturbed. The echoes remained. Children's laughter, market cries, lovers whispering in doorways. The Eiffel Tower still blinked over the rooftops as if to say, "You are home." She walked more slowly now, stopped to greet the fishermen by the Seine, sat longer in cafes. She no longer needed to prove she belonged. She simply did. She and Jacques lived simply, happily. Their days passed in quiet harmony. Books in the morning, visitors for lunch, walks in the afternoon, a fire by night. He grew older beside her, his kindness never dimmed, his humor intact. His presence, more than any title, had given her the life she never dared dream. And so she let go. Of the diamond collar, of the portraits in great halls, of the name that once swallowed her own. She was Consuelo again. Not the duchess, not the symbol, just the woman who had once walked behind a veil of gold and now walked freely through the gardens of Paris. "I do not believe I was brave," she once wrote, "only that I waited long enough to become myself." The applause had faded, the rooms had quieted, but she had not disappeared. She had arrived. Eventually, the hospital she had funded was opened with ceremony. It was the finest in France. In 1950, Consuelo was named honorary president. That same year, she received the Legion of Honor. Justin Godart, her lifelong ally, presented it personally. There was no stage, no anthem. In their home, in front of the household, he spoke simply, then turned to Jacques. "You have no decoration of your own," he said, "but may I ask you to pin on hers?" It was, Consuelo remembered, so very French. And then, stillness. That evening, the medal lay in its velvet case on the mantel. The house was quiet. Jacques kissed her hand and said nothing more. She looked out over the Champs de Mars, where soldiers had once marched and children now played. The cavalry had gone, the noise had faded, but life, real life, had remained. She had lived many lives: duchess, philanthropist, speaker, exile, mother, wife, myth. By the 1950s, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan had passed from the front pages into the margins, less visible perhaps, but more fully herself. The salons had quieted, the causes thinned, the applause faded. But in that hush, something sturdier bloomed, a sense of peace. Vogue called her a Grande Dame of Paris in 1953. Her name still opened doors, her bearing still commanded rooms. But what struck readers most was not her elegance. It was her clarity, her refusal to embellish. That same year, she published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. It was not a scandal. It was not a cry for relevance. It was a reckoning, graceful, perceptive, restrained. She did not write to shock, she wrote to reflect, and in doing so, she turned herself from subject to narrator. Readers met not a duchess, but a woman who had endured. She remained with Jacques in their home on the Champs de Mars. They read, they walked, they hosted when they wished. Their table welcomed writers and diplomats, old friends and curious minds. They spoke of politics and poetry, of past lives and present comforts. She had once lived inside a palace. Now she lived inside a conversation. And in those days, those quiet, unpublic days, she discovered something she had never known at Blenheim, the gentle thrill of peace. Not victory, not praise, just peace. But time is an unhurried thief. In 1956, Jacques fell ill. She nursed him with quiet devotion. The man who had helped her reclaim herself, who had loved her not for her title but in spite of it, was slipping away. When he died, the world barely noticed. She did. She left Paris for the coast of England, Southampton, a smaller house, a slower rhythm. Grandchildren filled the rooms. She answered letters in the morning, read Austen in the afternoon. The world moved on without her. She let it. She was not hiding. She was stepping away from the stage. In 1964, pneumonia came gently. There was no crowd, no headlines, just the hush of a final breath in a room of her choosing, beside a window open to the sea. She was 87. Her ashes were placed not at Blenheim, not in New York, but in the churchyard at Bladon, a short walk from the palace that once claimed her. She rests beside her son, not under a dome, but under trees. Not in exile, not in grandeur, but in her own quiet homecoming, by blood, by love, by choice. For years, the portrait had hung in the Great Hall at Blenheim, ivory satin, posture perfect, expression unreadable. Painted by Sargent, owned by history. But that woman in the frame was not the woman who died. The woman who died had walked through fire. She had been sold, silenced, posed, and praised. She had lost a crown and gained a soul. She had seen the shape of obedience and chosen freedom. She had stood beneath cloth of gold and whispered, "No one noticed I had disappeared." But in the end, she had reappeared. Not as a duchess, not as a relic, but as herself. Not the glitter, but the gold. Thank you for watching this week's video on Consuelo Vanderbilt. What do you think of her journey? Was she a prisoner of her mother's ambition, or a quiet revolutionary who forged her own path? Was giving up the crown an act of loss or of liberation? And in the end, do you think she found the true gold? YouTube often favors short, 15-minute highlight reels. But when I created this channel, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to tell the real stories, the triumphs, the tragedies, the brilliance, and the flaws. Not just names and dates, but full lives. Full women. We're not a studio. We're not a big company. We're just a small channel with a big mission, to tell women's stories the way they deserve to be told. If this resonated with you, your likes, your comments, your shares, and your subscriptions mean the world. They help us keep going, and they help others discover these stories too. And to our patrons and channel members, you are the heart of this work. Thank you. The mythic men and women who help keep this dream alive. The dream of telling the truth beyond the scandal. Of showing women not just in fragments, but in full flight. Velocity Girl, Zen Life 68, Jillian Barker, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafam Chung, Deborah Himes, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Amanda Lynn, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Maureen Toman, Beth Dawson, DDH, Kimberly Ray, Stephanie Warren Smith, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Supreme, Joya, Steve Weinstein, Deborah Chmielewski, Anna Livy, Roxanne Schuster, Kathleen Martin, Marina Barron, Melissa Pouliot, Kelly Bowen, Gwen, Melissa Gilmore, Kelly Patwell, Marsha Corbin, Randy Fox, Lucy Gonzalez, Curious Traveler, Deb Fisher, Indira Becha, Dreaming of the Kingdom, Sumari Henderson, Nikayla Rihanna, Sarah Blyberg Stanton, Will Kolb, Liz Karen, Maria Corrali, CTS Bathory, Snowball, Kendra McNally, Ida Kloster Jensen, Beth Dawson, Joanne Thomas Yakato, Laura Lamond, Morena Barron, Real Steel Magnolia, Janet Phelps, Catherine Rotensky Harrison, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, Michael Nelson, Karen Craig, Catherine Davison, Murphy's Bed, Lynn Sharp, Michelle Griffin McGregor, M. King, Virgie R. Nelson, Michelle Inman, Jamie Sue Kalamazoo, Susan Harris, Gus Gus the Cat, PB, Jen Kin, Michelle Lynn Neal, Michael Dean Augustin, Black Knight 5897, Wendy Fairfull, Trudy DeSwart, Susie Work, Deborah Britton Offer, Pitchick, Kate Lynch Ram, Fiona McDougall, and Julianne Scover. Thank you all for being the keepers of memory and allowing these stories to live. And to everyone, all the silent men and women out there who watch until the last note plays, thank you. Until next week, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history, and as always, thanks for watching Mythic Women.